my pleasure to introduce the last speaker of this week's conference, Katharina Kraus from Johns Hopkins University, who will speak on the life of the mind from Kant to Edith Stein.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you very much. This project actually started here in Notre Dame, but not quite here at Notre Dame because it was during the pandemic and we were all dispersed across the globe, but we found each other on Zoom. A few colleagues here and friends here, Therese, David, Chris McDaniel, father Philip Neri, we came together, and a few others, we came together for some Zoom meetings to discuss Edith Stein's finite and internal being. And that's when I kind of started thinking about her more properly as a philosopher and trying to figure out her philosophy. I'm afraid I haven't made so much progress since then, so this is still a very new project, at least it feels to me very new. But I gave the Kant talk to Alix, who obviously did a much better job with the feeling of life and the third critique. So I'm glad we had this morning. And now I'm here with a new project and a new person, a new philosopher, and a philosopher I'm not completely understanding. Well, I never completely understood Kant, obviously. But I still will discuss Edith Stein against the background of Kant, and this, I hope, is not only a biographical bias, but I think there is some interesting contrast between Kant and Edith Stein, which I will go into in the talk. So, the life of the mind in Edith Stein. Now just my slides would have to move. Is there... so I should move here?
Try it again.
Here we go. Good. Perfect. The life of the mind in Edith Stein, and especially the notion of what I will translate as intellectual life, geistiges Leben, plays a central role in many of Edith Stein's works, from her early dissertation on the problem of empathy to her very last and major work, Finite and Eternal Being, which was published only after her death. So a central concern of her philosophical work is the question of the specific kind of being that we have as human persons, and of major importance for our conference theme is the fact that she conceives of this kind of being as a kind of life. So the I lives and the life is its being, which is a very nice quote to illustrate this from Finite and Eternal Being. Studying under Edmund Husserl in Göttingen and Freiburg, Edith Stein receives her first philosophical training in the methods and theories of phenomenology, and the methods of phenomenological reduction often remains her first approach to a subject matter. What is particularly remarkable about her work is the fact that she later combines this approach with studies of the Aristotelian and scholastic tradition. So inspired by her Catholic conversion, she focuses specifically on Thomas Aquinas and finds valuable resources in Aristotelian metaphysics to resolve problems about the mind that have preoccupied her since her first study on empathy. I will not talk much about these aspects of her work. The works I'm discussing today are much more in the phenomenological tradition. So in what follows, I explore what I call her multi-level model of the human person, which involves indeed three types of life, namely what Stein calls the bodily organic life, das leibliche Leben, the psychic life, das psychische Leben, and the intellectual life, das geistige Leben. For reasons that hopefully become clear, I kind of resist to translate geistiges Leben as spiritual life, but maybe you can convince me otherwise. But we'll see, I'll stick with intellectual life for now. And each type of life adheres to its own distinct causality, and yet in the life of the human person, they are intertwined in complex ways. So although I draw on passages and remarks from her final work, Finite and Eternal Being, I reconstruct her model of the person from her early work, namely from the work that is translated as The Foundations of Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities. She wrote Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities around the time when she was also editing Husserl's ideas, and she similarly aims to develop a phenomenological account of the human person. So the overarching theme of aim of this work is to carve out an ontological space for the human person in relation to both the natural world and the world of intellects or spirits or whatever is captured by the German term Geist. But let me begin with a passage from Finite and Eternal Being that is particularly instructive. So you all, I hope, have a handout where you can also follow these passages. So here she is, following the method of phenomenological reduction of consciousness. She wants to she starts her investigation from the fact of one's own being, and she writes, "What remains after this phenomenological reduction as the field of investigation is the field of consciousness in the sense of the ego life, Ich-Leben. I may leave it as an open question whether the thing I perceive with my senses really exists or not. But perception as such cannot be crossed out. I may doubt whether the conclusion I draw is correct, but the syllogistic reasoning is an indubitable fact, and so all my wishing and wanting, my dreaming and hoping, my rejoicing and mourning, in short, everything in which I live and am, which gives itself as the being of the self-conscious ego. For everywhere in Augustine's life, in Descartes' I think, in Husserl's conscious being, Bewusstsein, or lived experience, Erleben, everywhere there is an I am, everywhere there is an I am. So I have a lot of kind of the German terms on the slides. I might read over them in the course of this talk because I don't want to annoy you with all this German. But in a way, it kind of shows and displays my struggle with translations. I find most of the translations very difficult. There is obviously not much research on her from the philosophical side. There are not many good translations available, so this is what it showed to me, to move from a major thinker to a very minor figure in the history of philosophy. And yeah, so you kind of just see part of my struggle because part of the translation I amended or did completely myself. So from this passage, we get a first idea of what she's talking about or what she's interested in, and I want to summarize some of her central questions that will be relevant for the rest of the talk. So first of all, the ego life. What is this, das Ich-Leben? What are the constituents of the ego life or the life of the self-conscious I? Secondly, what temporal structures and kinds of causality does each constituent exhibit? Thirdly, how are the different constituents intertwined with one another and thus condition, limit, or enable each other? And how does self-development relate to self-understanding? How does understanding one's own being contribute to becoming oneself? So with this last question, maybe I'm also imposing a question on her because that's kind of a research question that I'm pursuing for a long time, and I try to find resources for that in Stein. Now, what I would like to do in this talk is, first of all, to introduce her thinking with three phenomena. She describes phenomena of conscious life and take these examples to illustrate the complex temporal relations we have here. Then I will dip a little bit, give a brief background of Kant's theory of inner experience and the person as a reference theory, and then move back to Edith Stein and kind of give some sort of a sketch of her multi-level model of the person, first talking about the constituents and their causalities, and then talking about the intertwinement, in particular of psychic and intellectual life. All right. So let's start with the first phenomenon, present lived experience. The joy of receiving good news. It presupposes my attentive listening to the news and the knowing comprehension of its pleasant or joyful nature. But these presuppositions are not part of the unity of joy as such. It may well be that I have known about the news for some time before I begin to experience joy over its content. Either I may not have fully grasped its significance at first, or I may have been well aware of its joyfulness, but I was so preoccupied by other things that I may not have been able to rejoice. It's actually a wonderful thing that Stein always uses the example of joy. So many philosophers have talked about pain. She always talks about joy, even though her life was actually quite painful. So we can think a lot about joy. The I lives right now in the experience of joy, a little later in longing, and then again in reflection, but most often in several such experiential units simultaneously. The joy fades, the longing dies, and the thinking ceases. So what we learn from this phenomenon is the idea that in the present, our present moment is filled with what she calls lived experience. This is in German Erleben, and so these lived experiences are of a particular kind and have a particular temporal development. The second phenomenon I want to talk about is the phenomenon of recalling memories. And we've talked quite a bit about memory, so this is also something she's interested in. It is certain, however, that things from the distant past, which I have not been thinking about for a long time, can be made present. For example, the joy we had as children when our mother returned from a trip. This making present, or recalling, can happen in very different ways. Either I simply know as a matter of fact that I was happy back then and how deeply I felt this joy at the time. In this case, the knowledge is what I am presently living in, and the fact that I rejoice at the time is the object of my knowledge. The joy of which I only know is not a living joy, not even a vividly made present joy. The I does not live in it. But there is another way of recollecting, there is another way of making it present. It is then possible that I allow myself to be carried back to that particular time so that I live, as it were, in anticipation of the reunion and then once again re-experience, step by step, the reunion and the joy of the reunion. So what is now alive, present, real, is her question. And she'll give us some answers, and I'll try with her model, I'll try to explain what exactly is going on in the moment of memories. And the third phenomenon I want to talk about is understanding lived experience. So she writes, my joy, this joy that I'm feeling right now, arises and passes away. Joy as such does not arise and does not pass away. There are many experiences of joy different through the I that I experiences it, through its object, through its temporal determination and duration and many other aspects. But the essence of joy, however, is one. It is not mine or yours. It is not now or later, not last longer or short. It has no being in space and time. But whenever and wherever joy is experienced, the essence of joy is actualized. All experiences of joy are determined by it, this essence, as to what they are. They owe their name to it. And so, and maybe I'll skip this, I realize that those quotations are beautiful but also very long. So what the ego life would just be chaos, she says, if there weren't these essences that are actualized, and those essences give unity and multiplicity, organization and order, meaning and intelligibility to those units. So there we have three different phenomena, and I now try to make sense of each of these phenomena with the model of those different lives and the model of the person we get from Stein. But let's first briefly raise some questions here. What is going on in these phenomena? I think there are lots of confusing temporal relations going on. If temporal, so on the one hand, how can an experiential unit be experienced as arising and passing? Well, against which time arises it and passes it? The time of consciousness or the time of external objects? Secondly, how can the experience of a pastime be made present in our current consciousness? And how can a lived experience be understood as a causal event or series of cause and effect in time? And thirdly, why and how is the temporal development of the ego life structured by the understanding of lived experiences in terms of completely atemporal units of meaning, or what she calls sense contents? And finally, what she calls the problem of determination. Can the ego life be understood as completely causally determined? Are there additional, maybe non-causal factors that influence the cause of the ego life? And one aim will be to kind of figure out what exactly her answer will be to the problem of determination. So with these confusing time relations and confusing phenomena, I now move back and maybe make things even more confusing if I introduce some Kant. But Kant gives me kind of a framework, at least me, it gives me a conceptual framework to think about these things. And I think what we find in Kant are three kind of temporal modes in which we as human persons exist. So at the bare level, Kant has this idea that we have a temporal consciousness. And in our temporal consciousness, there's just a bare flux of subjective representations, just subjective successions of states. Then at a second level, and this was something I've been working on quite for a long time, there is the idea that of inner change. So things can change not only kind of for me subjectively, but according to an objective causal series of mental states in time. So my seeing or anticipating the mother as a child is followed, as it were, causally by my joy, and my joy is then followed by my decision to jump up, or something like this. So I have not only a mere succession of inner representations, but I have a kind of causal order of mental states. And then thirdly, there is, I think, in Kant also going on a notion of a mental life as a becoming a whole by an inner striving towards some sort of end or rational ideal that might be understood itself as atemporal. And I just want to say a little bit, especially about the first two levels, because they will be very interesting for us to understand what's going on in Stein. First, what is interesting is also that in Kant, so these are levels that are hierarchical levels of self-constitution. So one level is constitutes the next level. And so, first of all, Kant has an idea as a theory of the constitution of consciousness. Kant's theory is actually derived from the perception of external objects. And there the idea is that we have a complex interaction of different faculties. So if I see an outer object, like my cup on the table or people in the room, my outer sense gets some affection, and it gets supplied external contents for a spatial representation. And these contents are taken up into consciousness, and then the consciousness itself is some sort of synthetic activity, and so which in a way affects my own inner sense, and so only then we get a temporal order established on those conscious contents. So the idea is that each of these faculties comes with their own distinctive form or distinctive form, and so we get spatial contents that are ordered in time in consciousness, and this consciousness is kind of reflexive insofar that it is attached to one subject of consciousness. And this is kind of, at the time of Husserl and phenomenology, the background theory of all these thinkers. They still, in some way or other, stick to this model, but also tweak it in their own ways. So on the basis of this model, so this is the constitution of consciousness, and on the basis of this model, we can now explain temporal change. And I think I'll cut this a little short. I already feel I'm running late. So I think here the basic idea is that the only way Kant gets at a theory of inner change is by an interesting analogy from a theory of change in outer nature. So his whole argument for why I can understand my own mind and my own inner life as a causal series of events, like the anticipation of the mother, the feeling of joy, and my intention to jump up, as a causal series, is by drawing an analogy from how the outer world, the world of spatial material objects, is changing. And in the complex argument he makes, there is an important distinction between the subjective time of how my states are apprehended into consciousness and the objective time, which is the time according to which the states themselves change. Like, for instance, the states of the boat going down the river, or the states in which I look at a stable scene. I can apprehend them in different orders in subjective time, but there is only one, for a moving object, there's only one objective time in which it can follow. All right. So ultimately, the possibility of inner change and inner experience of myself in an objective time is derived from the conditions of outer experience and the possibility of outer change in outer nature. And So what remains from Kant at the time, I think, are three things. So first of all, Husserl and the phenomenologists still think about consciousness in a theory of constituting itself. There are hierarchical levels of constituents of the human person, and time itself is constituted through consciousness itself. Still, physical causality serves as an analog of psychological causality. We will find this in Stein's model as well, so this is a little bit of an anticipation, while taking into account some specific differences. And thirdly, the psychological I, or the empirical person, as a becoming reality, striving towards a purposefully organized whole of mental faculties, acts, and states. This idea is also preserved in those later people. But I haven't said much about it. I will spell this out with Stein. But there are a few problems with Kant that the people after Kant, of course the German idealists, but I'm looking more into later people, and especially the phenomenologists, they kind of see certain lacunas in Kant. And one of the lacunas is Kant apparently cannot account for what they call inner lived experience. And they use a new term. They use the notion of erleben instead of the Kantian notion of erfahren. The Kantian notion of erfahren is still very representational. So when I was talking about inner experience, innere Erfahrung in Kant, it is a representational notion. I represent myself and my states as, for instance, being causally connected. But there is something different with the notion of inner lived experience insofar it is understood not as a representation, but as a mode of being. Secondly, it seems like from those sketchy remarks on Kant, we only have two time structures, at least in the world of appearances. There is efficient causality and teleology, but both are understood in terms of a linear objective time sequence. Either we are starting from a course in time, the anticipation of the mother is starting off this whole series I was talking about, or is running towards a goal in time. But there only seem to be these linear time sequences. And finally, there seems to be a much more diverse psychological or psychic phenomena, which it seems have no space or are not actively discussed in the Kantian picture. But those are actually the subject matter of his inner experience, and many of Kant's successors think that they cannot be fully or adequately accounted for, because it is captured in a reductive way through this analogy to outer experience. So in some sense, you're getting, even he is aware of reductionism, you're getting some sort of a reductive picture by drawing this analogy. So with this background, let's move back to Edith Stein and her multi-level model of the person. Let's start with the constituents. So the three constituents we have is the four, actually, but I'm only talking about three. Consciousness, pure consciousness. That's the stream of lived experience with individual units of experience. And then we have corporeal life, or leibliches Leben. That's the life of the organic body as it can be consciously perceived and experienced. I will not talk much about this part, but we can in the Q&A. Then there is psychic life, the real I with actual life force, Lebenskraft, states of life and feelings of life. And then there's the intellectual life, intellectual acts with meaningful content and intentional direction, motivation as a connection between these acts. So let's briefly look through 1, 3, and 4, and then look at the interaction between 3 and 4. So first of all, Stein follows Husserl's conception of pure consciousness and his theory of the constitution of consciousness. So she says there is an original current of consciousness, which she calls pure becoming, and which now reminds me very much of Bergson, and a continuous generation without causation, no series of set of phases, no causal connection. But this original current is then constituted through meaningful units of experience, or through lived experience. So there is a formation of units of experience that arise and persist and pass away, and the stream is now constituted from living phases. And this stream runs in time, but the time it runs in is called the phenomenological time, in which lived experience follows, which lived experience follows lived experience in immediate succession. And there is a simultaneity, or the simultaneous in experiential time, where experiences can overlap and together fill a now, the moment of experiential or phenomenological time. So I try, at least this is the last talk, and so at least you get some pictures or some of my sketches here to look at. So, so in some sense, this is how I picture this stream of consciousness. You have kind of these phases, these units coming up and arising and fading. They can overlap, and at some point you have a now, and that can be filled by overlapping units of experience. They have different durations, intensity, quality, type, and genre. But now what is interesting about these, again, I think we can see, you quickly will notice certain similarities with the Kantian picture of the constitution of consciousness, because every lived experience, according to Stein, has three constituents. It has a content that is taken in, or similar to the outer affection and the outer content taken in the Kantian picture. But these contents can be extra, I don't even know how to pronounce this, but I should go with my own interpretation, which was external to ego and internal to ego. Contents, they have, but now this is maybe a difference, they have an experiencing of the content itself as the process of being taken up into consciousness. It somehow is similar to apprehension, but the emphasis is now on the going through the experiencing itself of the content. The undergoing, for instance, of an external sensation or the feeling of eye consciousness. And it also comes with an immediate awareness of this experience in comparison with it, similar to the self-affection I was talking about in the Kantian picture. But there's no act of reflection so far on the content or the experience itself. And the more intense the experience, the more undividedly we are absorbed in it, as it were. As I said, each of the components of the ego life comes with its own distinctive kind of causality. And interestingly, she sees the causality that is at work in pure consciousness as a Humean event causality. So in a way, she also says these phases are just in contact association. So one phase is just in contact or associated with the next. And so there is a causing event and a caused event. So for instance, my anticipation of my mother coming back home is the causing event. The joy I'm feeling is the caused event. And then there is this incident that intervenes between the two causes. But interestingly, at this level already, she I'll skip this point, but the interesting at this point, the carrier of these states, or the carrier of this consciousness, is just called the pure I, and it's has not yet individuality or an individual determination, but it is the carrier of the stream of lived experience, and it's in some sense inseparable from the pure experience. It's in itself empty of content, and this, of course, heavily reminds me of Kant's I think of apperception. But so this is not where her model stops, but now we get to the next level, which she calls the psychic life. And the central distinction we have here is between pure consciousness and psychic life. And I think that, I want to say, is similar to the distinction I made between this very basic temporal consciousness in Kant and this idea that we have an inner change of mental states. So the psychic, for Stein, concerns the domain of transcendent reality, in a now Husserlian sense, transcendent reality as being transcendent to consciousness, and not in the Kantian sense of being transcendent to the bounds of sense. So, in which lived experience and experiential contents manifest themselves. So she uses this notion of manifesting. And apprehension of pure experience is then understood at the next level as a manifestation of real psychic states. So the real I, she now introduces a real I that is understood as the real substrate with changing states and properties. And it is understood as the seed of a life force. It itself has this persistent real property of a life force, the efficient force of bringing about states, bringing about psychic states. And these psychic stage causes, this life force causes current states of psychic life, or psychic occurrences, as she says. And those states can then be experienced as feelings of life, or they come or are accompanied by certain feelings of life. And it would be an interesting question to see how much she joins the Kantian notion here or not. So feelings of life are the consciousness of what she calls the status of life. So it's more something like the wariness, the excitement, the invigoration you feel that accompanies a certain unit of experience. Now, interestingly, again, psychic causality is, or psychic life comes with its own causality, and it's not the Humean kind of causality, but it's a different kind of causality, namely what one could call substance causality, which under certain interpretations we also find in Kant's second analogy as an interesting interpretation there. So life force is understood as the real efficient cause of all psychic events in an individual, and all psychic reality necessarily has a cause. And this goes along now with the analogy with physical causality. So there are causal relations within an individual, and the individual is understood as a thing analogous center in analogy, on analogy with the causal relations within physical nature. And now those feelings of life are called the modes of life forces. So all these states are now, or how we feel these states are now, in a more metaphysical sense, I think are called modes of those states. For instance, the mode of wariness or the mode of invigoration. These are the two modes she's mainly talking about. Either she seems to be tired or excited about something, or invigorated by something. So what this comes down to is that it primarily looks that at the level of psychic life, we have a thorough determinism in place. So all psychic events are causally determined. And she goes with the psychology of her days that we can find psychological laws that tell us how exactly those psychic events follow one another and can be predicted, if only we know the conditions, the current conditions, and enough of the causal factors that are going on. But at this level, it seems a thoroughgoing determinism. So again, a little illustration to make this a little bit more vivid. So we have our stream of lived experience that is a Humean event causality. We get underlying this kind of substance causality. So this is, I don't even know what exactly, but I think the dark green is the substance that is continuing through life. It has the different dots are the states it's going through. And those states is understood as a causal mechanism at this level of a substance, the substance causing these states. But these states themselves become manifest at the level of pure consciousness. That, I think, is the picture we are getting so far. Okay, so let's move on from there, because with this picture we can now understand the 1.5 of our phenomena. Phenomena 1 completely and phenomena 2 a little bit. So the joy of receiving good news, you remember this example, and so what is the entire unit of experience? This particular joy is closed or completed at the moment when I no longer experience this joy, or at the moment when I may again experience joy, but not with respect to the same object. So there is the idea of an arising and passing of joy as a single unit of experience that follows an earlier unit of experience in the stream of lived experience, and that entails a later one. And the experience of joy is now understood as a manifestation, or maybe in the sense of an appearance of a psychic reality of the ego causally brought about by its life force. That would be the first picture how we can understand lived experience. What about the memories? You might remember that she ends this idea of being carried away and reliving, re-experience the past memory. So what is now alive and present real? And she replies to this in the following way. Now I'm reenacting, nachvollziehen, that what originally took place back then. It is something similar to the understanding co-experience of what another person is currently experiencing next to me. As long as the joy of the other or the joy of that time is only reenacted, only this reenactment is my present life. But the joy is not fully alive. But my former joy or the other's joy in the way of a making present, which lags behind the full liveliness of my present joy. So the reenactment is not as lively as the original joy, but it has life in it. So the reenactment, however, and this is the moment where it's becoming more complicated, requires an intention. I direct my, or at least if we follow this example, I'll allow myself to be carried back. It's always the question how intentional this act is. But if it is an intentional act, then it requires me to direct my mind towards the content of the memory, towards the past event. It requires me reflecting on the state of memory, and it possibly requires a motivation to bring this experience back to life. And once we are at the level of intention and motivation and reflection, we are at the level of the intellectual life. And this is where it's actually becoming more interesting, how we now can understand that the intellectual life and the psychic life are interacting with one another. So the intellectual life, for lack of a better translation, is characterized as a special class of units of experience. And she calls these units of experience apprehensions, Auffassungen, and acts, Akte. All acts of intellectual life have intentionality. They are directed towards an object which she calls the sense content. And every mental act consists in a reflection, for instance, on some sensation data on an external object or on the act of consciousness itself. And these, especially apprehensions, have now subconstituents as well, namely an apperception where we are appending the earlier to the later, a synthesis, a combination of single apprehensions, and a motivation being set in motion of the later by the earlier apprehension. And while the first two terms clearly remind me of the Kantian picture, the last term is not present in the Kantian picture, and that's the one she's most focusing in. Why do we need these motivations, which for her is a very general term, that she uses, that's something in mental life, in intellectual life, that is actually doing the connecting between the acts and has its own lawfulness. So now I really need to speed up, even though we are just coming to the really interesting stuff. So I run through this a little bit more quickly. So first of all, these motivations in a way give our intellectual life a direction. It gives a direction towards certain acts and towards certain intentional contents. And now the question I really want to understand is how these acts and their motivational relations give actually structure to that stream of lived experience. So far we only have this stream of experiences, but how actually do we get those particular meaningful units? That's the unit of joy, that's the unit of longing, that's the unit of thinking. So how do we get those meaningful units? And I think that is the work of the intellectual life, and where the intellectual life is kind of doing some sort of downwards causation towards the psychic life and the pure consciousness in the end. So one thing, an interesting thing that I haven't completely understood, and I'm presenting it here as far as I understood it, so motivation is, she says, the basic lawfulness of intellectual life. Intellectual life, again, has its own lawfulness, and that's the lawfulness she calls motivation. And here's a quotation. Living in the execution of an act, the ego is turned towards the object and progressing from act to act with a steadily changing substantial sense. Nevertheless, there exists the possibility at any time of making the sense into an object, or making myself into an object, unfolding it, and from it inferring norms for the process of motivation. And then she goes into an example of a syllogism. From that, the norms is to be inferred that whoever brings a value to givenness should set himself the goal of its realization. From this, it's to be understood that the entire life of X comes under rational laws, which the subject itself can teach itself by insight, and by which the subject can assess the factual process of its motivations. So, in some sense, if I understand her correctly and what she's writing there, it's all of a sudden we move from having been focused so far on the workings of the psychological life, we now move on the objective content itself of these acts. And kind of from looking at the objective content itself, we derive back norms from how we should lead our intellectual and eventually our psychic life. So, for instance, she gives the example, lightning turns into my motive for the expectation of thunder, not the perception of lightning. Of course, I start with perceiving the lightning, but upon reflection and upon going through some intellectual work here, I kind of understand that it's not that I am perceiving lightning, that there's thunder, but because there's lightning, there's thunder. So I'm kind of moving back to the, I'm connecting now the objective contents, and from this I apparently get norms for how the intellectual life is structured. Okay, I'll leave it there. We'll discuss this more in the discussion because I have to move on. And so far, coming back, and this closing with the, I'm not yet closing, but I have to run a little. No, I started 5 minutes late. Okay. So the question is the question of determination. So far, I gave you a completely deterministic picture of psychic life, and now talking a little bit about the intellectual life. And one of the questions I had at the beginning was, well, is this psychic life completely causally determined, or are there other non-causal things going on? And now we are at this point where this problem is not yet resolved, because what we have so far is the causality of psychic life follows a mechanical causality in analogy with the causality of physical nature, whereas the life of the intellect follows the laws of motivation that are directed at objective reasons or values, but they fall out of the causality of physical nature. So between causality and motivation, by causality she means psychic causality, therefore is a radical difference that nothing can reconcile and that no transitional processes can mediate. This brings us to say that psychic causality has its analog in the realm of physical nature, but motivation does not. And now she doesn't leave it there, but she moves on and says, but there is a certain intertwinement between psychic life and intellectual life that hopefully help us to make more sense with how there can be a kind of influence of the intellectual life on the psychic life, even though it's not efficient causality. Let's talk a little bit for a few last minutes on this intertwinement. So I think, so first of all, let me read this out and then summarize how I understand it. When I'm notified of an event that carries an objective value or even a positive meaning for me, then the comprehending of that value fills me up with joy. So I get this message that my mother is coming home, or that some other happy message, and then I need this comprehending. This is an intellectual act, and only once I have this comprehending can I kick off the state of joy. Otherwise, the state of joy would not occur in my psychic life if I hadn't done this intellectual act of comprehending that message. Thus, there exists between the two experiences, and I take it to be the being notified and the joy, a relationship that is just as much causal as it is motivational. The emergence of this causal factor is obviously necessary so that an actual motive can come out of a possible motive, or out of something to which objectively motivating power is due, something that according to its sense either permits or requires a determinate behavior of the subject. So one thing she is doing is thinking that not only is there the comprehending of making sense of what that message actually means, but she goes as far as to say, well, this intellectualization or this intellectual act kind of releases a life power itself, that it gives, it kind of pushes, it kind of unfolds in the psychic life as its own life power. So there are now actually two different kinds of life power. So it's not only that by comprehending through an intellectual act, the intellectual act gives us a direction in which to interpret or in which to go in our psychic life, but it actually also gets, as she says here, gets the experiencing to go in that direction. So this all of a sudden sounds to me as if there is some efficient causality now at work, which she puts into the terms of there is, in addition to the sensory or psychic life power, an intellectual life power. And okay, we'll leave out bodiliness entirely. So obviously we have, so here in the middle, obviously we have to distinguish between natural life and the life flowing in from without, which we will call intellectual, since it's acquired in mental acts. So the idea is that in intellectual life, it's actually not coming from within, as it were, but it's something that is coming from without, that is flowing into our psychic system of energies. So, and very finally, in the rest of the book, and it's a very complex book, she's spelling out different sources of this intellectual power, and sources can be the objective, what she calls the objective intellect, constituting the world of values, and she goes in an interesting theory of society and how society as an intellectual collective kind of gives life power, intellectual life power for the individual, but also how other subjective intellects gives life power. Okay, in interchanging, in communicating, we are exchanging kind of our intellectual life powers. Good. Now, do we now have a solution to the problem of causation, to the problem of determination? Well, she says we have the following solution. So I go right to the quote that is actually important. So on the one hand, she now comes up with a very holistic story about what is going on. Further, we know, she says, that the psychic states of a person at any given time does not depend only upon the history of her life, the psychic history of her life, and the present circumstances. That would be sufficient to explain it in efficient psychic causality. Rather, her entire life is decided by the core of personality, by that invariable repertoire of being that is not a result of development, but on the contrary, prescribes how the development proceeds. And this core of personality is the core of her intellectual life. So now she's introducing not only a psychic history of life as the totality of psychic occurrences until a certain time t, the time we are looking at right now, and the circumstances as the current external and internal conditions at time t, but we're also looking at a personality core as it were, which is grounding the totality of the intellectual life, and which is primarily understood as being atemporal. And so there are some, I think there are some relations to what we talked about in Bergson, but we can maybe take this up later. And just the picture to maybe leave you with a final picture here is the sense we are now not getting away from this linearity we have been talking about so far, but we are talking about a core that is somehow unfolding in time. That is an entirely different picture, I think. So the intellect shows itself in a future-oriented motivations and intentions in time, but really what it has an atemporal depth structure. It's a core that is unfolding, and its central dimensions are depth and range, the range and how far can it kind of unfold its potential or its force. So if we put now all of this together, I think we get something like this. So we are having a stream of experiences where we have these units of lived experiences. We kind of interpret them as psychic occurrences according to a mechanical causality, but really they are kind of inspired or kind of structured according to an intellectual life that is kind of unfolding itself from a core of personality. We could talk lots more about what kind of external influences come in from physical nature or social structures that in a way disturb the unfolding of this individual core into the psychic life and eventually the stream of experiences. And I think I probably leave it here. This would be, now we can maybe understand the third phenomenon and why understanding lived experience gives inner structure to our psychic life. But I think I want to leave it with questions I have about Stein. And these are the questions. Well, is to what extent does Stein actually solve the problem of determinism? Does she advocate a deep intellectual indeterminism that is compatible with an apparent surface determinism at the psychic level? And is Stein's postulated transition in the end between a timeless form of being, the personality core, and a temporal experience and psychic events even plausible? But I think it is a really interesting model to think more about. Thank you very much.